to the WAC 2022-23 women's basketball schedule preview show. I'm Kendra Sheehan, joined by Ben Wilson, ESPN play-by-play. We'll do the NBA G League Ignite play-by-play. He's done several of our WAC basketball tournaments. He's worked several championships, swimming, soccer, baseball, you name it, he's there. Ben Wilson, we're so happy to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Oh, what an intro, Kendra. I've missed you guys. It seems like forever since we were all in Mesa for WAC baseball. And yeah, here we are. We're ready to go. New season just right around the corner.
I know, everything's happening so quickly. It seems like just yesterday that baseball was wrapping up, and now we're already into fall sports. Week 0 past week 1. We got football coming up. It's so exciting. So let's start. We have several key matchups that we've kind of prepared to go through as we look at this schedule. And we'll start with one that is likely a rematch of the WAC tournament championship last year. It is Stephen F. Austin taking on Grand Canyon. They play each other January 7th at GCU, and then they'll play each other again February 11th at Stephen F. Austin. SFA, it was the team that went to the NCAA tournament. They joined the WAC for their first year last season, and they just absolutely dominated. What can you tell us about this matchup? It's going to be a lot of I wouldn't say bad blood, but you know these two teams are heated and ready to play each other again.
Oh, no doubt. And I think, too, what's really interesting, we talked last year, all the Texas schools that had joined the league, and you had these home and homes, and it was really interesting for a lot of these schools that have been in the conference for a while, like a GCU, making those trips to Texas. And we saw this both in the men's and the women's basketball schedule, where it was really tough. It was definitely like a growing experience, and I think you saw a lot of those more like Western Coast schools have to adapt really quickly, and they struggled too. And I think you saw too a season ago. I mean, everybody coming into last year was talking about California Baptist, so I know we're going to get into. And so for GCU, is an interesting spot, right? You're trying to unseat the defending conference champion who had this crazy 2020 undefeated season, and yet at the same time, kind of out of nowhere comes this Lady Jack team, who, by the way, is still going to have 2 of their 3 leading scorers back from a season ago. And so that's, for Molly Miller, who's built that program up so quickly at GCU, she's done an outstanding job getting them into a position to compete for conference titles here, which is what everybody expects there for the Lopes program. But it's one of those things where we look top to bottom of that conference, and there's so much parity. And I mean, you think about 9 of the 13 teams won at least 8 conference games a season ago. It's pretty amazing in its own right. So for these two specifically, yeah, you think about the conference championship game and how those two teams squared off last season and how good of a run it was for SFA. I definitely expect, now that you have a little bit of history now and these teams are a little bit more familiar, I'll be really interested to see how these games will match up, especially the two, like you talked about, Kendra, in the regular season. But it's funny, like coming into last year, CBU was the team with the target on their backs. And this season, it really will be the Lady Jacks. And for good reason. I mean, that team was so loaded last year. They were so consistent from start to finish. And they did something that very, very few teams can accomplish, which is, running through an entire conference slate nearly undefeated. So that, to me, those are the most scintillating couple of games when you think about program really on the rise in GCU. And now that team, especially heading into this year, still with a lot of pieces back, who is going to be the front runners to come out of the league.
And you look at what head coach Molly Miller has done with that GCU program, 40 wins in 2 seasons. And she went into the transfer portal. And something I love about that is she grabbed Aaliyah Collins from Chicago State. She grabbed Sid Palma from CBU, and she got some Summit League transfers. So she got a few new pieces that should take over for losing Amara Graham in the offseason.
No doubt. And it's funny, I actually covered when Coach Miller was at Drury, which is a Division II school in Missouri. I was at that point in Missouri before I moved out here to the West Coast. And I remember covering her and her teams. And even at the Division II level, she was widely respected just as being a tremendous recruiter. And she was always able to usually make the most of wherever she was at and get really, really good players in. So it's not a surprise to me, just kind of knowing her from her previous stop and having covered her teams in the past, that she has transitioned that in. But yeah, it's especially too with the portal now, and we've seen how the WAC has grown. As I just talked about, the parity. There's even on it, even in a team you mentioned like a Chicago State who had their struggles in the past. There was really, really good talent. Even on the teams further down, in the conference. And so for her to, there's so many things to like about GCU, just from the overall program and the way we talked about them being on the rise. And you have a relatively young coach who connects really well with players and has been a really proven recruiter. I think you're seeing that manifest itself. And I think the younger coaches definitely have somewhat of a bit of a baked in advantage, just knowing that the transfer portal now, it's a thing that everybody is pretty used to if you're a younger coach. And to me, you're comparing that to maybe someone who's been around for 2-3 decades, who kind of has a system in place for how they go about recruiting. You kind of have to throw that out the window now. And like, when would you ever have seen intra-conference transfers with different schools? It just usually doesn't happen. But it's kind of the world we live in now, and that's certainly one. You look at some of the coaches who have been really, really successful, and Coach Miller's really, certainly among the top 3 or 4 you would look at as saying, like, they probably have the goods to at least find a transfer or two that could be really, really impactful. And as you point out, it definitely seems like that's been the case this year.
Certainly, and there's a few more of those inter-conference transfers that we'll talk about as we keep going through our schedule. But Stephen F. Austin, of course, having that last year's WAC Coach of the Year should be a great matchup. Another one that we have, and you had mentioned a bit, California Baptist taking on Utah Valley. So that'll be January 7th at UVU, and then they'll play each other again February 16th at California Baptist. It seems like both of these teams really lost significant players in the offseason. Utah Valley losing Josie Williams, Maria Carvalho had transferred, and then, of course, California Baptist loses Ane Oleta, Brittany Thomas, Georgia Dale, Caitlin Harper, who also transferred. So really, what can we expect from two teams that lost a lot of key players and are going to need a lot of their younger guys on the roster to step up?
Yeah, I think, to me, Kendra, California Baptist is probably the most intriguing team in the conference this year. And it's simply, I mean, you listed players who have been in all conference. These are not just solid rotational pieces. I mean, Ane Oleta has been a conference player of the year and arguably one of the best mid-major point guards in the country the last couple of years. And so the run that they went on with her, and you think about how everything clicked when Brittany Thomas came back from injury in 2020, and they go undefeated and they make it to the quarterfinals of the WNIT. And you think about how I'm sure for them looking back, knowing that last year was always likely going to be that last run with that whole core together, a little disappointing, to come up short in that what was an incredible game, probably the game of the tournament on the women's side last year when they lost that that really tight game to Grand Canyon. So I wonder too, like we've seen how well they've been able to reload, and especially since transitioning to Division I, it's hard to find another program, just if you look around the rest of the country, who has handled a transition immediately with that much success that well, like CBU has done. And so this definitely would feel like a season of transition. I'm sure that if you talk to Coach Jared Olson, who's just he's enjoyed nothing but success there, and he's again another guy who's been a tremendous recruiter, has been able to get the most out of a lot of unheralded recruits, many of whom he brought in when they were still Division II before they were transitioning to D1. This will teach us a lot, just where they're at as a program, the Lancers. And so UVU's, they're another one of those teams that appear to be somewhat on the rise and kind of lost in that shuffle last year, Kendra. I mean, everybody talked about SFA, GCU, CBU, but Utah Valley, they were the 4th team that got to double-digit wins in the conference last year, and it's always a really, really tough place to go play on the road, and they were able to really get a lot of those teams who, especially on the back ends of long road trips. They're the classic team, though. It's like, especially as you talk about with a younger roster, can they travel? Can they go to the Texas schools and pick up some wins in conference? Because they've always been a team that has certainly has had a little bit more of those predominant splits versus home and road, and you see that a lot of times too with the Utah schools or the schools who play at elevation, especially in these conferences that are more spread out. So definitely two teams in years of transition. I wouldn't be surprised too if the Wolverines, with some of the younger core that they've developed, given some of the transition with these other schools, if they're a team that could threaten for maybe an outside shot at a 3 seed this year in that WAC tournament.
I was looking at all the players on the roster last year and kind of the transfer portal, and Madison Grange, we used to call her highlights as Madison Grange with the range, and she transferred to University of South Dakota, so no longer gets to do our highlights. But California Baptist finished their 4-year transition, so they are officially eligible for the WAC tournament title and at a NCAA postseason title. As we keep going on, we have WAC newcomer University of Texas Arlington taking on Sam Houston. That's February 16th at UTA. UTA, a team that, we don't know necessarily too much about as being new to the WAC, but we saw what they did in the Sun Belt. They won the Sun Belt. They went to the NCAA tournament. It was their first NCAA appearance since 2007, their third time in program history, and they were led by Star Jacobs, who appears to be returning on the roster. So it seems like they have a bunch of good pieces to potentially make a run like Stephen F. Austin did this past season. Would you agree, or what would you have to say?
Oh yeah, no doubt. And you think about you think about Sam Houston as well. There have been a couple of the crossover matchups too. They played Sam Houston last year pretty early in the season, UTA, and beat them going away. Sam Houston, a team who ended up being, ended up 9-9 in the conference, but had a pretty impressive run. And you think back to the overall women's tournament. They really pushed CBU in that it was that quarterfinal game, the 3-6 matchup. So that was a Sam Houston team that when I did that game, the CBU Sam Houston game, and came away really, really impressed with them. And I think the general consensus for Sam Houston was, all right, we have a lot to improve on, and we have a lot of growth. But it doesn't just seem, Kendra, like this has kind of been the theme of the WAC. Like no matter what sport, anytime there has been expansion, whatever these new schools come in, have usually been at or near the top of, for multiple sports, whatever conference they were just leaving. So like you take a conference that, remember heading into last year, it was like, wow, GCU, CBU should be really, really elite. Oh, and then you're just going to throw in Stephen F. Austin, who was, the absolute class of their league before transitioning in. Now you're going to add in UTA, who not only, I mentioned, beat Sam Houston last year, went to UNLV, beat a UNLV team that was a 13 seed in the NCAA tournament, beat South Florida, who was ranked top 15 in the country at the time, and had some really, really impressive wins in that stretch. So even though, I honestly thought I think maybe just because of the strength of schedule and conference, they were a little bit disrespected by the committee. They only got a 14 seed. But even then, like they really pushed Iowa State last year. So that's one of those schools, and I kind of talked about earlier, when you look at like the GCU SFA matchup, where now that they've had a year to see each other and they get used to those trips, I would imagine it's going to create a bit more of a rivalry type feel this year. But UTA, I'd certainly give them a big edge, where you're in a position where teams don't really know you as well. Sure, you can do the game by game scout, but it's not necessarily going to be as program deep as some of these other schools that you'll see. So I definitely give them a leg up. And we saw, SFA proved last year, you can come in with no real knowledge of this conference, and if you have the goods and the talent, you can make a run and immediately establish yourself. So UTA, like how they fit in this year, how they match up against SFA, and then where those schools all align will be really, really interesting. Like I was saying earlier, I think you have to make those. You would think on paper the three likely favorites at the top, and then there's a ton of other challengers though. Like I mentioned, Utah Valley, and even Sam Houston, who was just a team that was like a 3-point barrage every time you watched them last year. If that kind of goes to the good this season and the variance kind of goes to the right side for them, that's also a team that could threaten there. So really fascinated to see what we get out of UTA this year.
Certainly, and with head coach Sharika Wright, she's in her second season as head coach. I was actually listening to this Houston podcast, and the host had asked her, in the season that she was in, as early as she was as a head coach, did she expect to go to the NCAA tournament? And she said that we had all the pieces. We had a good, 7 core seniors that really helped us. And so she had said if this was going to be the year to do it, like they were going to do it that year. And so she seemed confident, but also confident in some of the players that she returned. And of course, Sam Houston was that team that, they started 0-6 in WAC play last year. Of course, they didn't have their head coach, Raven Justice. She did take some time off for personal reasons, but when she was back, they won 7 of their 8 games. So never discount the Bearcats, certainly, I think is what we learned in WAC play last year.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. I'm impressed, Kendra. You're listening to like the Deep Dive podcast. You're doing your homework. No time off. You didn't take any vacation this summer. Like I know how this goes. That's what is impressive about you. You're always digging for the stories. That's what makes you one of the best. All right.
No time off. Thank you, Ben. You're one of the best. You're one of our favorite people to have on the podcast. Throughout the podcast, I guess this is our new show, but we'll keep on moving. We have Abilene Christian at UTRGV January 21st at ACU, and then they'll play each other February 11th at UTRGV. Now, the Vaqueros knocked out the Wildcats 73-70 in Vegas last year in the tournament. These are two teams that have, one of them, that I don't think they really have a lot of veteran presence on either team. If I'm really looking at them, Maddie Miller is going to be one of two grad players on that Wildcat squad, whereas UTRGV ultimately lost some of their players. Sarah Bershir is no longer on the roster. And just because I'm rambling here about all the facts I looked up in this, Sarah Bershir went to UAB and will actually play with her sister Tracy Bershir, who went to Oklahoma State, and so they'll both play with each other at UAB. So
and the Brashears loss, I mean, I remember she had, I think, 3 threes in that 8-9 matchup, which was like one of the sneaky, really fun matchups of that tournament. Both teams came out, and I think too, that was a great example last year of teams that have familiarity with each other, and they knew the opposing game plans pretty well, and it was all just a matter of execution. And you saw those teams last year, like when they faced off in the tournament, it was just like quick release. They were ready to go up and down tempo. I think that first quarter, if I remember correctly, there were like 45 points. Actually, I'm looking at it now, 44 points combined in the first quarter. So it was super up tempo and fast. And for UTRGV, I think, it's a school that goes under 500 last year and 8-10 in the WAC. But I mean, they showed flashes. And I think what was obvious with that program was when you rely a little bit too heavily on the 3-ball, which they kind of admitted that was the case at times. If those nights where it's not working, and if you don't have necessarily other ways to score, you can, especially in this league where the whole theme of, I feel like, this show, Kendra, has just been the general parity and how deep and talented all these rosters are. If you're relying on just that one area of scoring, it can become a struggle pretty quickly. So I'll be curious to see just the overall consistency from them this year. And then, as you mentioned, for ACU, it's funny how, if you talk to, like, on the men's side, where that program has just been defined by defense and grinded out in low scoring games. And in a way, the women's team was kind of the opposite. I mean, they put up some really, really big point totals last year, but at the same time, the defense was an Achilles heel at times. And in the regular season, I mean, you think about the 2 games last year against UTRGV, they scored 88 in a win at home, and then they gave up 82 in a loss on the road. So I'm consistency to me is kind of the theme with both those 2 schools. We saw glimpses at times, but we also saw where they had pretty significant Achilles heels, and that's at the end of the day what kept them in that 8-9 range in the tournament.
It'll be interesting to see ACU and their scoring, how that's affected by losing Jamie Benarenz, who's now an assistant coach at Cameron University, and then they also lost Tatum Barbara. They did bring in 4 true freshmen. It looks like 5 transfers, so they do have some height that they brought in, but it will definitely be interesting to see how they have to change the way that they play on the offensive side of the ball. And our final matchups that we're going to be looking at is Utah Tech taking on WAC newcomer Southern Utah. So December 29th, they will play at SUU. That is the opening week for WAC play, and then January 19th at Utah Tech, formerly known as Dixie State. Utah Tech, a team that went 10-19 overall last year. This is just kind of what I would say is just a huge rivalry game. We talked about it a lot with football. I mean, the 2 schools are, 40 miles apart. I think, with Southern Utah being new to the league, I think that's kind of, I guess, the theme of this is just the absolute battle between the 2 Utah schools in the league now.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And at least, like, for me, being based in Vegas, a lot gets talked about, like, in covering UNLV as well as I have in the past. That it is always talked about Cedar City, where Southern Utah is at, and by proxy you have St. George with Utah Tech, and it's like both of those places, sort of how we talk about in the same mindset of Utah Valley. Really, really difficult places to play. It's not just the elevation; they're smaller schools, but they're able to create really, really good home atmospheres. If you haven't seen a game, and people will see this now for the first time for Southern Utah, playing a really cool, intimate, small little arena that gets really, really loud really easily. You don't need that many fans there to make it just feel like a really imposing type of environment. So, I would say obviously on the Utah Tech side, I mean, just a lot of transition in general with the university and coming in Now you have the change of name there, and you're trying to get back to at least more near 500. And it was amidst a pretty demanding schedule a season ago. Got to 6 wins in the league, but they're right there with like the Seattle and the Mexico State type teams. Certainly, a notch below that other grouping right in the middle there. And so to me, it's all about, can you take another step in development and growth? Whereas for Southern Utah, even though it is a change in conference, this was still, like, again, not quite to the extreme as UTA, where they just ran through their league, but Southern Utah was a really good Big Sky team last year, and they went out and played a pretty solid non-con. I have to think they'll have a little bit of a kind of a bitter taste in their mouth from how the season ended, where they go into the Big Sky tournament. They had played really, really good ball heading in. I think they'd won 3 or 4, and they ended up getting to 14-6 in the conference, and then they're upset. They lose in the first round to Idaho, and that's sort of how their season ended. But if a team, you look at what they did at home, and it was very tough for teams to go in there and win. 10-4 home record last season. And they, even though they took their lumps, they did go to UTRGV last year and put up 80. They beat the Vaqueros on the road in Edinburgh, so there's at least a little bit of familiarity there in the conference. But it seems to be a team that on paper kind of projects as like a upper mid-tier sort of group, one that easily could threaten for a top 6 seed, I would say, for Southern Utah.
And their head coach, Tracy Sanders, for Southern Utah. She took a team that had 3 wins in 2018-19 season to 18 wins the following year. So never count out the Thunderbirds when you have a head coach like that who can transform a program and snag some, actually snagged Megan Jensen from Utah Valley in the transfer portal. We were talking about interconference transfer portal. So very interesting. Megan Jensen was a solid player for Utah Valley. Well, Ben, we want to thank you so much for joining us and helping to break down some of these key matchups. We're so excited for the upcoming basketball season.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for the invite. The way these seasons always work, like before we know it, it's going to be November opening weekend, and then all of a sudden it's going to be WAC Vegas, and we're going to be at we'll be getting post-game meals at I don't know what our restaurant of choice was last year at the Orlando. Fridays. How could I forget, Kat? I went so many times, I just forget. My brain became
7 times in 1 week.
You went 7 times. Let's set the record clear. You and Sed Bonner went 7 times in 1 week. I only went like twice. All right, let's let the record show that. But no, I'm very excited for the season to start, and it's it'll be really interesting to see. Super, super deep league. And I mean, there are, like, to me, a lot of really, really good schools in the mix here. And, 5 or 6 that I would think are going to be really, really solid.
Certainly. I think what we predict now, a couple months from now, will have probably no bearing on what the actual case is. You never know.
How this usually works.
Well, that was Ben Wilson, ESPN play-by-play. He's done our WAC basketball tournaments for the past several years, done a number of other WAC events for us as well. Thank you so much for joining us. For the full schedule, head to our website, wacsports.com. I'm Kendra Sheehan. We'll see you for the men's preview show.